Today in the EU, the ceasefire in Lebanon, and Europe's waning role in the Middle East.
I just spoke with the Prime Minister of Israel and Lebanon. I'm pleased to announce that their governments have accepted the United States proposal to end the devastating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
A ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Lebanon took effect a bit more than a week ago, last Wednesday, but ever since, more than 100 violations, mainly on the Israeli government side, according to CNN, have happened, casting doubts on hopes for peace in the Middle East. Besides condemning the breaches, the EU has been absent from the negotiating table during this tense moment. Will the ceasefire agreement hold? And why is the EU incapable of acting in the region? I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm joined in the studio by Bilal Saab, head of the U.S. Middle East practice at Trent and former advisor to the Pentagon. Hi, Bilal.
Good morning, or I guess good afternoon in Belgium.
Bilal, you are from the country. Can you tell us how people still living in Lebanon and even people from the diaspora in the United States feel regarding the ceasefire agreement and what are their sentiments towards Hezbollah and how things unraveled?
Anger, tons of anger. I would say that I don't have polling in front of me, and I don't think we've had a poll in Lebanon since the mid 20th century. But you could fairly say that there's been a lot of anger, frustration, disappointment with the organization having unilaterally made the decision to support Hamas and then basically wreak havoc as a result on Lebanon, which is exactly what happened in 2006. And I could assure you that parts even of its own support base are not happy with it, obviously, given the destruction that has been visited upon them and their homes.
Mm-hmm.
You got to remember that there are parts in southern Lebanon now where these people still cannot go as part of the ceasefire agreement, right?
Yep.
And it's a long stretch, along the borders. And that includes my own village, by the way. So, yes, a lot of anger, a lot of, frankly, now relief that the intense fighting has stopped. And the last thing they want to see is a return to arms. Absolutely.
Something that's striking to me is that the moment the ceasefire news came out, people started returning to their homes, even if they knew that some of
Yes,
it,
yes.
were not there anymore. If they would prefer living in a tent on their own land rather than somewhere else.
Yes, that's exactly what I told CNN. I think they asked me, like, how quickly do you expect the Israeli citizens to return to their homes? I said, not as quickly, but I bet you that the moment the ceasefire is going to be announced, southern Lebanese are going to race back to their homes, at least those who are permitted, because this is how they've done it in the past, and they can't wait to go back and start to sort of rebuild and, figure out how to reconstruct their homes and so on.
So after 2 months from since the invasion, Israel and Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire that came to effect last Wednesday with heavy involvement from the United States and France. Why did it happen now?
Well, because I think that the Israelis first and foremost realized that some serious diplomatic costs they were going to have to suffer if they were to continue with the military action. I think that there was a threat of pursuing something at the United Nations Security Council, some kind of a resolution against them to stop the fighting. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I think the Israelis realized that the returns on using more military action against Hezbollah were going to be diminished. So I think they pretty much accomplished most of their military aims, and therefore diplomacy was a good way to wrap it up, essentially.
Hmm. And this diplomatic agreement is mainly a U.S. made agreement brokered by Biden's team. Can you walk us through the terms?
They agreed to a ceasefire. You got to remember, ceasefire does not mean the end of the conflict. And it's a 60-day ceasefire or truce, which means that there's a lot of work to be done still. As you can imagine, emotions are still very high between the two sides, given the intensity of the conflict. The mistrust is obviously very deep. There's a whole history between them, obviously. This is not the first confrontation between them. Very briefly, the agreement essentially requires Hezbollah to move away from the border of Israel by, let's just say, 20 miles or so to the north of the Litani River,
Hmm.
in addition to its equipment, not just its fighters, so heavy equipment, long range stuff. And then the Israelis would also, within the 60 days, withdraw from southern Lebanon, sort of in a phased approach. And then the Lebanese army would be asked to deploy roughly anywhere from 4,500 to 5,000 troops to, I would say, provide security at the border, sort of be part of this buffer zone, if you want to call it, monitor any violations, so on and so forth. But they will not be alone, as you said yourself. They will be aided internationally by primarily the Americans and the French as part of this new monitoring mechanism, which didn't exist in the past.
Yes, precisely about this. It's not the first time that we're talking about ceasefire in Lebanon. The previous agreement goes back to 2006. And the main difference is now that the United States will be spearheading a committee to monitor the results and what's happening on the ground. Do you think it will make a difference?
I don't know is the honest answer, but you do have some diplomatic muscle there. I mean, we're not talking about irrelevant countries there, obviously. And the question is, you can have the best monitoring mechanism on the planet, but then what does that mean in terms of enforcement? These are two
Yeah.
very different things, right? Let's just say there is a violation, and there have been, by the way, several already, and you could see them, you could report them, you can monitor them, but then who enforces, right? So at this rate, I think obviously it's been the belligerents enforcing violations. It's been Hezbollah and it's been Israel itself. The Lebanese army is supposed to be playing some kind of a role in enforcement as well, but we haven't seen that yet. I think the biggest question marks so far in terms of implementation have been on the very issue of enforcement. What are the parameters of enforcement? What are the legalities? What is the legitimacy of all of this for both sides? So far, it's been sort of ad hoc, and we're all praying, hoping that, whenever they do enforce violations, assuming those violations are legitimate, that it wouldn't spiral out of control and we go back to, conflict between the two.
Especially because we're at a moment, well, we could talk about the past decade where the United States has been resizing its influence in the region. So, what actors do you see stepping up to maintain peace or at least to try to broker a peace deal?
None. I could give you a very flowery answer and tell you that, oh, yes, the international community, Arab powers, blah, blah, blah. But no, I think no matter how you perceive the United States' role in the Middle East is, which it's fair to say that yes, I mean there's been a lot of downgrading of that role, especially militarily speaking, diplomatic speaking to some extent. But in Lebanon, I don't think you could really make those assumptions. There's been a good degree of involvement on the part of the Americans. You got to remember the Americans were behind the demarcation of the maritime borders between Israel and Lebanon. So that's a pretty interesting diplomatic success there. And lately, with this mediation, yes, as imperfect as it is, but it does signal a pretty interesting involvement as well. So look, the United States will always have an oversized influence over Lebanon and its diplomacy. Yes, the French now are playing a role given its old history with the country and cultural influence. But anybody, frankly, beyond that, it's just hard for me to see that they would have really any interesting role.
Do you see then the Trump administration continuing the job that the Biden's team is doing to maintain the ceasefire? Do you see them taking a different direction?
So, listen, if you start with the words of the president himself, which is, I want to end wars in the world or in the Middle East, right? Then that should translate into some concrete actions, policy decisions that would, yes, maintain the ceasefire. The Trump administration has just appointed a special advisor on the Middle East who is of Lebanese descent. So that person will have some kind of sympathies for obviously Lebanon and, maintaining the country's interests, sovereignty, independence, so on and so forth. So how much of an influence would it make? I have no idea,
Mhm.
but I think it's certainly a factor to consider if that person will have sufficient, influence over the decision making of the Trump administration. As you very well know, the president is very personal, right? So
Yeah.
he's less of an institutional process based kind of decision maker. He relies a lot on personal connections and so on and so forth. So if Mr. Boulos will have some kind of an in with the president, it might just have a positive effect on Lebanese interests.
And I think it's gonna depend on what situation Trump will have to face once he comes into office. As you said before, the ceasefire has been breached already. Both sides have been blaming each other since last Wednesday. On Tuesday, the Israel defense minister said they would not differentiate between Hezbollah and Lebanon if the deal were to be broken. So, and again, we're speculating here, but do you think the ceasefire can last 60 days?
I don't think there's any interest in a return to a full fledged, intense conflict because of the reasons I told you about before. I don't think there are
Hmm.
further military objectives to be achieved by Israel and Lebanon. This is very different from what's going on in Gaza. I think they realize that the pragmatic goal there is to significantly degrade the capabilities of Hezbollah, create some kind of a buffer zone so to allow the return of those Israeli citizens to their homes in the north. Beyond that, it becomes an act of wishful thinking, very unrealistic. I don't think they could disarm the organization. I don't think it's in the cards. And the Israelis are going to have to be very careful about how they manage their relations with President Trump. I mean, this is someone, once again, who is very serious about ending wars in the Middle East, and they're going to have to cooperate with him on that and sort of have his blessing on issues that are far more profound, serious for them, which include the Iran broad issue, right?
Hmm.
So if they were to make so quote unquote concessions on Lebanon, maybe they could seek his cooperation on the bigger picture, which is Iran.
And it's also in the interest of Hezbollah to respect the ceasefire, especially because Lebanon needs to be reconstructed. There are parts of the country that have completely been reduced to rubble.
Yes.
So where do you see Hezbollah in the equation, especially when it comes to reconstruction?
Quite weakened, obviously militarily speaking. I think we're all still trying to figure out how weakened are they politically, right? So
Hmm.
yes, you've been harmed politically, you've been crushed, leadership changes, decimated, but does that translate into political weakness at home? I mean, they still have their guns, obviously, they could direct against the Lebanese, and they have done that in the past. And there's this whole issue now, obviously, of the presidential elections in Lebanon, which, I mean, the country hasn't had a president forever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, they're going to have a say in it. How big of a say? I think it's still significant. Can they control politics in Beirut the way they used to in the past? I don't have answers to any of those things, but surely we can say that the organization as a whole has been weakened. How it reacts to that weakness, whether it lashes out against the Lebanese or it sort of, adopts a kind of a different, softer approach at home, I don't have the answers to those things.
Thank you.
And next,
I'm here in the studio with Julien Barnes-Dacey, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hello there.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, you have written extensively about European policy in the Middle East, including the faults of this type of policy. How do you see Brussels' current standing regarding the ceasefire deal in Lebanon and the infractions of it that we've witnessed in the past few days?
Europeans are struggling as ever, I'm afraid, to be relevant here. This was a deal that was largely constructed under US auspices. The French were obviously part of it, and they are supposed to be part of the monitoring mechanism going forward. But as the deal already becomes under pressure, no one is really looking to Europe. The first meeting of the monitoring mechanism has not even happened yet, even as there have been multiple and particularly Israeli violations of the agreement.
And do you think Europe has grown too comfortable in a Middle East that used to be dominated by the US? Is that why?
Well, I don't think they're comfortable any longer. They're lost.
Hmm.
Europe sees the Middle East and North Africa as a theater of threats and challenges, but it's not an area where they have much ability to shape developments, to influence developments, or leverage to make a difference. Yes, they relied on the US for a long time. The US is now withdrawing, regional actors are stepping up, and the Europeans are trying to find their place in this new balance.
Hmm. And the EU High Representative Josep Borrell said that you would help support this ceasefire with a wide range of instruments. Now, what concrete tools does the Union have at its disposal?
Well, for the ceasefire itself, not much, to be honest.
Mm.
I think that there is a sense that Europeans can help with some of the broader elements of the arrangement in terms of building up the capacity of the Lebanese armed forces, helping them to move into the south of Lebanon, in terms of wider political and economic support to the Lebanese government. But really, in terms of the direct conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, that's not an area where the Europeans are truly able to come in and make a fundamental difference. The Americans can make a difference there. They're the ones that have some weight and some military leverage and have the political ability to press Israel and Lebanon to change course.
And here in Brussels, there's this argument that Europe is far removed from the Middle East and should therefore not be involved in regional challenges. Besides, it already provides economic weight through sanction policies and humanitarian aid. What do you make of that?
I think Europeans know very clearly that they have to be engaged in the Middle East. There are far too many overlapping interests at stake here. What happens in the Middle East plays out directly into Europe, whether it's security challenges, migration challenges. So I think that Europeans know that this is part of their own neighborhood, that they need a stronger, more strategic, more united approach to the Middle East and North Africa.
And something that you've written about as well is Europe's incapacity to engage and confront non-state actors that yet are a crucial piece of the puzzle in the Middle East. Let us think about Hezbollah in Lebanon alone. Do you think Europe is not equipped to deal with armed groups, and therefore that's part of why it's so lost in dealing with the region?
Well, clearly it's a really challenging environment to work in, and Europe is kind of accustomed to working through a certain approach towards state systems, central governments, and in the Middle East that no longer really exists in many places. With regards to Hezbollah, there are obviously voices in Europe who see it as a terrorist organization. There are some who engage with it. To my mind, Hezbollah is going to have to be a critical element of any solution in Lebanon and between Lebanon and Israel. Europe will have to find a way to engage with the group. They have to be drawn into an inclusive process, whatever we may think about them. They are effectively the partner that is fighting Israel now. And if you want a ceasefire with Israel and Lebanon, you have to find a way to get Hezbollah to agree to the terms of the deal. So Europe does need to find a way to deal with these actors. And that's not just in Lebanon, in Libya and Yemen and elsewhere. If Europe wants to advance a stabilizing, inclusive process that can actually move the region away from conflict and instability, then these are going to have to be people that they are talking to.
And are you optimistic that this will happen anytime in the near future? The context is the one of a 60-day ceasefire, a very fragile one. There's not necessarily a peace agreement on the table yet, and there's a lot to stabilize in the region.
In Lebanon, the risks are acute. I think the ceasefire is incredibly fragile. We've seen multiple violations. It's hard to see how the terms of the deal can be fully enforced. I don't think that all the parties genuinely want a sustainable peace here. And so I think there is a significant risk, particularly given really the lack of an enforcement system and the fact that the enforcement mechanism is very weak. There's a real risk that it could collapse very quickly. And part of that is to do with wider regional dynamics. The fact that Israel is continuing its military campaign in Gaza, which was the driver and the source of the wider regional conflict, the fact that broader tensions between Iran and Israel continue to escalate, the fact that the situation in Syria is now deteriorating rapidly, all of these are pressures that will bear down on Lebanon, that will risk fueling new conflict there, and which risk a wider regional conflict escalating even further.
Thank you, Julien.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our newsletters, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. Don't forget to leave us a star review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sainz de Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.